Good morning. This is Joe Robertson coming to you from All Souls Community Universalist Unitarian Church at the Community Forum. I'm a member of this church and a member of the Forum Committee, a forum that for more than 75 years has sought out important conversations, promoting critical thinking on the most compelling and challenging issues of our day. And today we welcome Aaron Deacon. He's the managing director of the KC Digital Drive and a steering committee member of the Kansas City Coalition for Digital Inclusion. So we're going to be talking things like our digital future, the critical pursuit of equitable access, and what's in store for Kansas City with the next generation. So Aaron, take it away. Thank you for being on the forum.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to the forum for having me. Excited to talk to you all today and share some of the work that we've been engaged in, and really somewhere I think, I don't know, some of the things I guess that I think about as we as we engage in the work we do. So I'm going to do a few things over the next 30 minutes or so. We'll give an overview of our organization for those, which I assume is most of you who probably don't know who we are, what we do, and then kind of go into the internet specifically as a utility and the idea of smart city, talk a little bit definitionally about some of these ideas, and then how that leads into both some opportunities and problems going forward in terms of how we think about systems governance and shared decision making, and ultimately how we create a better world for ourselves, which is I think where we're heading, and technology presents some really interesting problems and opportunities both. So we're about 10 years old. We're celebrating our 10-year anniversary this year, and we are a nonprofit civic organization that is really designed to bring additional capacity to the rapidly changing and emerging technology context that we see in the world today. And we do that through cross-sector alignment and building communities of practice that can adapt to a wide range of scenarios. So we touch a lot of different areas. I'm going to talk first sort of about what it means to be a digital leader, and this is kind of informing how we think about the whole system that is built up around technology at its base. But we talk about equity and inclusion and digital inclusion and access, but that's really one kind of piece in a larger stack of how we think about the challenges of emerging tech. So when we talk about making Kansas City a digital leader, we kind of look at these 6 areas. And really, and I realize, so for those of you who aren't watching and seeing slides, these 6 areas are technology infrastructure, data, meaningful use cases, new businesses, products and services that can be developed from the use cases, and then finally, a lens of equity and inclusion and literacy around these kinds of technologies. All these things are quite different, but they relate in really critical ways. And among those 6, I think you can kind of further break them down, into groups of 2. So when you talk about technology infrastructure and data, those are both kind of foundational layers. One, which is a physical layer, your fiber cables, your hardware antennas that transmit wireless signals, your computers, your devices, your servers, your data centers. You've got to have technology infrastructure to manage the technology world, and then you have data that traverses that environment, machine readable information about the infrastructure itself, about the environment, and especially about the people that use it. And we'll kind of come back to that because I think that's a really critical difference. So on top of that infrastructure, once you have that infrastructure in place, and that is a lot of that is here. But you can be a leader in that, right? So, I mean, part of our mission, we want to see Kansas City, I mean, this is happening to the world all over the place. It's happening at different rates in different places. We think it's important for Kansas City to have world-leading infrastructure, both hard infrastructure and data infrastructure. But once you have that in place, then what do you do with it? And a lot of people get excited about that. There are a bunch of people that they want to do, well, that's fine. I don't really care about the wires or the fibers or the spectrum. I want to know what's it going to do? How's it going to improve healthcare? How's it going to improve education? How's it going to improve access to services? and new businesses, right? So, and we separate these two things, right? So there's the use cases. How can you use the technology to do a thing better? And then how do you make it sustainable? How do you fund that? Does it create new jobs for people? Does it create new economic opportunities? Does it create new service lines for existing businesses? Because it's not always intuitive, and there's a lot of things that can go right or can go wrong between both how you create the use case and then how you monetize it. And so once you hit that layer, if you look at those two things, use cases and new businesses, products and services as two components of kind of, I'd say, the application layer. First layer is infrastructure. Second layer is applications. The third sort of bucket, which includes, an equity and inclusion lens and process and thoughtfulness around how we do these things equitably, as well as technology literacy, whether it's in terms of political decision-making or economic decision-making, democratic governance. Those are really value-driven in a way that, there's certainly values that drive these things kind of throughout, but they're how do we make sure that both the underlying foundational infrastructure and then the things that we use those technology tools to do actually create the kind of world that we want to live in. So that's kind of a high level overview of the space that we work in. We say digital leader for short, and I'd say honestly, most people don't think of all of that within there. It's really hard. It's a lot that is baked in, and it's pretty complex. So for the most part, we deal in a lot of specifics and a lot of projects. Our organization is really a three strategic pillars, three program areas, and the dominant one is Solutions Lab. We are interested as an organization in finding solutions across this stack of areas. And that looks different at each place, but we try to be cognizant about which kind of solution, because solutions in the realm of data or tech literacy have very different considerations. We have two other things that we do that really support that. We do a lot of community building work, building communities of practice, and then sometimes the things that come out of our opportunity identification, which is Solutions Lab, are specific projects that will help to run. So I'll talk briefly about each of these and then kind of move on from us as an organization. But the goal of Solutions Lab is really to develop solutions for difficult public problems that either use technology or sometimes are caused by technology. We have found that the public sector and the nonprofit organizations, who really are our primary clients, if you will, are really limited in their capacity. Sometimes it's capacity around expertise or knowledge, and sometimes it's actually capacity around just having enough hands to do the work. And emerging technology is really a lot of times a specialized knowledge area. So we bring together stakeholders that have both authentic community-based expertise in knowing what those problems are, but also the people who have the expertise in the technology and some of that more specialized knowledge, because there aren't a lot of natural forums for those things to meet. And then we really do that with a focus on action, more so than planning, although obviously the planning is important. So we've got a lot of, the activity work within that. We do design workshops, we do hackathons, we do journey mapping and idea development, business model planning, with a goal towards creating kind of new pilot projects. Those could be, technology driven, they could be data driven, they could be infrastructure, they could be literacy, programming, and equity driven. But we want to see new projects kind of come out for the community. In order to get there, we spend a lot of time on the community building piece, because that's where the ideas come from. And we think having collaboration, diversity and inclusion among the kinds of organizations and stakeholders and people that are on the ground in communities is really important, as well as having communities of practice around some of the specialized expertise. And the reason for this is because new technology emerges quickly and it changes quickly, and it's a really fluid environment. If you wait until something arises before you start building your relationships, the situation is going to change quite a bit but before you get to the point of doing a project. So we want to make sure that we are kind of constantly building communities of practice around a subject area or an industry cluster like healthcare or education, sometimes around a technology. like gigabit fiber, which is how we started, or blockchain or data analysis, and sometimes around a policy goal or problem. And I'd say the Digital Inclusion Coalition fits that model, right? We've got an objective here that prior to kind of doing this work was not a well thought of, certainly not an industry cluster, and it is not really specific to a certain technology, but it is a policy issue that has emerged that a lot of different stakeholders from a lot of different places, a lot of different industries, and a lot of different kinds of technology experts are interested in solving. And so having that community of practice in place is important. So the work that we do there is really more convening and facilitation, thought leadership, organization building, serving as a backbone organization, so that we can have relationships in place in a more collaborative ecosystem that helps us respond to opportunities and develop solutions in a timely manner. Sometimes there are projects that have a natural home, but a lot of times there aren't, especially with emerging tech. So we will, in select cases, take on a project delivery role, whether that's as a project manager or filling in sort of staff or gap support for another organization that may be a lead on a project. A lot of times it's just not clear how to move some of these things forward, or again, especially emerging tech, it's new and it's specialized expertise, and it sort of fits within somebody's bucket of work, but maybe not. And so just in terms of our kind of board and organization culture, we've got a willingness and agility to act in ambiguity. We've got a really broad network of resources from all of the community building work that we do, so that we kind of know who to engage and try to build trust to engage them. And that is both in terms of people who have the capacity to act, but also that have the knowledge and the expertise in a lot of specialized areas. So the project deliveries could be consulting projects, it could be strategic planning or kind of document creation. Sometimes it's software builds, but it's kind of our book of business, as it were. And some of you may know this really emerged out of Google Fiber's arrival in Kansas City about 10 years ago. And we didn't have this model created at the time, but as we looked back at the work that we did, we saw each of these pieces that kind of came into place in what was really a landmark technology infrastructure build in Kansas City. We had a private provider who is willing to invest somewhere between $300 million and $1 billion in infrastructure within the community. And as we worked with Mayor James and Mayor Reardon at the time, and the folks at Mid-America Regional Council, which is where we grew out of, realized that the capacity to do this kind of work just didn't quite exist. There was an interest in it, and there was a recognized need for it, but it wasn't a great institutional fit with existing civic organizations. And that's what led to our organization first to kind of address that immediate opportunity. But we knew as we were kind of building our capacity and our model that same issue would happen with other kinds of emerging tech over time. And so we took an approach of, on the one hand, addressing the problem at hand, but also with a view towards how do we build this sustaining capacity so that we can deal with other emerging technology in a new way. And the result of that, I would say, first of all, is a whole bunch of partnerships. And this deck is a few years old, and it's not comprehensive, but in terms of our model, and kind of thinking about how we create solutions, it's identifying these nonprofit public sector organizations who are doing good, trying to make the community better in a lot of different ways, and figuring out where we can kind of bring some expertise and capacity around emerging tech on their behalf, and then engaging a lot of corporate partners, entrepreneurs and startups, university researchers, national partners, and people in other cities who are doing the same work, so that we have a resource network. There are a lot of people out in the community that may not necessarily be empowered or have an official role, but that are really interested to help their community in this work and have a lot of knowledge and expertise. And so that's kind of been the model, again back to where we started, to to create an organization that that has that capacity. And it's been really interesting, I would say, over the past couple of years, and quite surprisingly, that the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of highlighted this unique capacity. We've gotten much more involved in COVID response than I ever expected that we would. And some of that was technology driven, around sharing vaccine data between different public health departments. But really what was interesting, even though COVID itself wasn't a technology problem, it absolutely was a problem of new knowledge introduced suddenly, public sector organizations with very limited capacity, a really dynamic and quickly changing sort of information on the ground situation, and a lot of people that would get in rooms and say, well, somebody ought to be doing something about this, or here's the thing that needs to happen, but well, whose job is it? We haven't built the system for this yet. And so have spent quite a bit of work in that space, and some good, some maybe not as effective, which is part of our model too. Anytime that you work in the innovation space, you've got a pretty high tolerance for failure, and I would say that is, I think, one of the hallmarks of this kind of org, and we've helped start similar orgs in a few other cities. I'd say we've got maybe 1 or 2 dozen peer organizations throughout the country. And another sort of interesting factor is this idea of kind of combining that innovation mindset of it's okay to fail sometimes, or even a lot of times in terms of the projects that you pull out, with that inclusion and equity mindset, and kind of really thinking about, if you think about the innovation curve, I don't know, some of you may have seen this, you kind of, a new technology comes in and you've got a really small percentage of early adopters, and then you've got sort of something becomes mainstream, and then you've got your late adopters, and then at the far end of the curve, you've got, your laggards, your people who haven't caught up. It's kind of a bell curve model. And our organization and our peers, I think, are a bit unique in really focusing on the margins of that curve, trying to bring together the people who are the farthest behind and the farthest ahead, and have some sort of unity of thought and action in terms of how we approach emerging tech and new problems. So that's kind of an overview of what we do and how we play in the community. And I want to look kind of next at a couple analogies or terms that you might have heard, kind of ideas that we encounter a lot. One of which is thinking about the internet as a utility, and the other is this idea of smart cities, which I think Joe had called out kind of in this, when he'd asked about this session. And but both of these things kind of come from this systems approach of thinking at things. A lot of people will talk about, when we talk about broadband access or access to the internet, access to technology, we need to be thinking about it as a utility. We need to think about it like electricity or like water, make it easy to get into the home, relatively inexpensive, very broadly accessible. And in some ways, I think that's a really good analogy. But in some ways, not a great analogy, and it is certainly a very complex analogy. I think people make these things kind of easy. Oh, well, if you just make it should be like water, it should be like electricity. Remember when we electrified everything? But a couple of the problems, I think, with that analogy. One is that electricity and water, both are very complex systems. So I think it's good in this sense. Complex systems, they have a deep infrastructure component to them, as well as kind of a product that's at the end of the pipe, as it were. But I'd say that product, both water and electricity, is something that is fairly value neutral and can kind of be treated like a natural resource. So it's delivered into the home. It's one product. It's the same thing. You get, you get electricity, you get water, and then you've got, in sort of, that original kind of follow-ons, right? You've got meaningful use cases. You have applications, you have things that you can use electricity for. You see, air conditioning come in, you see home appliances, you see this entire kind of stack that is built on that. But it's really, at least to me, sort of this model of a natural resource that comes in that then human beings get to use. Whereas with the internet, a lot of what you're bringing in is other human beings. So and I'm interested, when we get to Q&A, how people react, or if this metaphor kind of hangs together. But it feels like there is a different extractive model in terms of how we deliver each other to each other through the internet than how we deliver something like water or electricity. And that has a lot of implications for how we think about the interoperability of the system, how we think about governance, and how we think about decision making. And we've seen in previous utility models like water and like electricity, and even like the transportation system to some extent, that we actually do have different kinds of governance models that have emerged. You look at public utility boards, investor-owned utilities, rural electric co-ops. In water, we have water boards. We've got this whole sort of, these are elected positions a lot of times in the public sector, but they're not necessarily well-known elected positions. They're not, decision-making models that people follow in the same way that they follow your mayor election or president or governor. They're systems that are set up to cross state lines. They're systems that are set up to cross city lines. They sort of recognize that the system has an existence that transcends how we think about traditional jurisdictions. But I'd say they're not something you learn about in your civics class, right? So we've got a complex structure, a new kind of system delivery, a way of thinking about interoperability and governance and decision making that is specific to that resource. I think in the case of water or electricity, but the kind of resource that we're delivering, even though some of the mechanisms for delivery are similar, the kind of resource I think is quite different, and that's where we kind of get to smart city. The smart city is used in a lot of different ways, but I'd say at its base, kind of thinking about it from a technology stack, connectivity is one important piece. So being able to connect a lot of people and things to one another. It's also sensors, and that could be, like hard sensors that are detecting movement or motion or temperature at a certain location. But it's also sensors like, your phone that detects you walking around, is collecting data. So you've got data collection, you've got sensors, you've got those things all connected to one another, and then you also have computing and analysis and ultimately decision making as part of that, right? And so the smart city is not only collecting data and delivering it. It's not only a one-way kind of pipe like electricity or like water is, but it is taking that data and then making decisions, which generates new data, and it becomes this really sort of recursive loop, and in some ways self-governing. And the idea is that you should have a more efficient city. You can pick up trash better if you know where the trash is and you know where people are putting it out or where they're not putting it out, or you can change your street lights in a more efficient manner so that you can control the flow of traffic better. But in an idealized smart city world, these things are kind of happening in real time, and the ability of human beings to interact with that system is way different than it is in, for example, the context of water or electricity. And so there are a bunch of tropes that kind of come, or that you might hear if you go to smart city conferences, and some of those get at that idea of resource extraction. So people will say data is gold, or data is the new oil. Was something that people would say for a while, that sort of takes this idea of the internet as a kind of natural resource. But then you hear other slants on this, people who say things like, well, if the services are free, then you are the product. Or in a lot of sort of scientific research and engineering, they'll talk about human in the loop as how some of these systems function, where people become not just the receiver of a resource that is delivered through a network, but actually part of the network and part of how the resource is generated, part of what we feed back into the system, and a lot of times with somewhat limited visibility, or understanding, or even agency. And so when we think about not just equitable systems and inclusive systems, but really how we fundamentally make decisions, and as a society kind of weigh in on on how this all works, it's tough because it's constantly changing in response to us. So I think that we still need this system of interoperability and governance and decision making, but we really need to think pretty deeply about interoperability, about what is the role of each kind of layer of the system, which things can be contained within that layer, and how you sometimes maybe dial back from making decisions about the whole because it just gets too complex, and you need to focus on doing sort of one thing well within that system. And I'd say the sort of the overlying or underlying paradox of this entire system of the internet and of the digitization of society is that it does, on the one hand, encourage this systems thinking, where you see these technologies and you're like, well, I don't care about the infrastructure. I don't care if it's fiber or if it's wireless. I don't care if you've got a mobile phone or a computer. I don't care about the device. I don't care about the particulars. What I really want is for people to be more educated, or for more kids to graduate from high school, or for people to live longer. Those are the things that really matter, which is hard to argue with, right? You've got outcomes that people care about, and so people will focus their energy on this systems thinking. But by doing that, you sometimes lose attention to the individual layer where you can actually make an impact. And you also have a situation where the individuals, the humans in the loop, as it were, become really atomized, become really individuated, and become nodes in this bigger network. And so you kind of paradoxically have this big system where you're looking at societal level or systems level outcomes, but then what is the role of the person within that? And I think because of this sort of inability, I'd say, or maybe it's just reluctance to kind of really think critically about interoperability, about what is appropriate, what is the appropriate role at different layers. We see a lot of confusion about how we use words, and we start making assumptions about what things mean, and they get blurry because they mean a lot of different things. And I'll give a couple of examples. I mean, I'd say one is data-driven decision making. And you hear this in government a lot, and you think about government decisions. Well, we want to be fed by these algorithms. We're collecting all this data, and we want to make sure that this data helps us to make decisions. And I'd say this even extends, I think, to some degree, to how we see the idea of science used in different ways in society. And in some contexts, science is a body of knowledge. In some contexts, science is really a method that is long and slow and deliberative and very diverse. And in some cases, it's used as sort of a cudgel, or as in lieu of policy making decisions. And however you kind of use that, I think I certainly use it in a lot of different ways in different conversations, but we don't really have a great vocabulary for thinking about, which of those definitions are appropriate at which times and to make which decisions. I'd say we have another similar situation when it comes to thinking about equity. There's equity can mean a lot of different things. And at each of those layers, you can have equitably deployed infrastructure. You can have equitable access to applications. You can have equitable skills development. And the reality is that there are certain kinds of inequity that we are willing to live with, and certain ones that we're not. And I think a lot of times, people, have this intuitive sense of fairness. There's ways that they think about, a sort of common value system, but we often we often wrap those things up into one word to mean a whole bunch of different things, because we're not really thinking about the different layers of the system, what is appropriate to a given individual or a given organization or a given person, and what they can actually achieve. And a third one I would say to kind of to that point is shared vision. You know, we have this idea of a shared vision. Well, when we're doing kind of collective impact work, let's just all get together in a room and hear what everybody thinks and hear kind of what people's values are, and you know, identify our areas of common ground and then move towards those. But I think we sometimes undersell how much diversity there actually is between different people's visions of what the world is or what the world ought to be. And I think it may feel like we're a long way from that slide around the different stacks of the internet, but I think it's it is definitely, at least to me, seems related, that we've got these systems that because they are so recursive and they feed people back to each other, that it becomes really easy to blur sort of conversations about fundamental infrastructure and about outcomes and make them all about one thing, and it just becomes less kind of clear where the lines are drawn. And so when we talk about you know, things like common vision, or what should our end state be, there are some things that I think are kind of easy. You know, people should be able to be healthy, whatever that means. You know, we don't want people to be sick. We don't want people to be hungry. We want people to have access to information. We want people to be educated. But when looking at all of the outcome questions, which I think have an intuitive sense of, yeah, we pretty much agree, you know, that that being sick is bad. But we have some disagreements, and I think some fundamental disagreements on, you know, how bad it is and when it's good, and how you make decisions about systems level trade-offs versus individual level choices. So some of the conflicts that are I think laid bare by this sort of smart city systems approach are between liberty and efficiency, between convenience and excellence. And a lot of this comes back to sort of the principles that we don't really talk about, and a lot of that, I think, is, you know, sort of underlying deep philosophical questions around anthropology, around epistemology, and around sort of, you know, the purpose of life, right? So you get into these kind of big philosophical questions that people don't want to get to in public realm decision making, because they're not easy. We don't have mechanisms to do this, and they become very contentious, and we sort of make this assumption that you can ignore those things. It doesn't matter, you know, what you think the purpose of life is, or if you believe there's a God, or if people have souls, because there are things that we agree on, you know, like everyone should be educated or everyone should have food on the table. But the connection between those underlying beliefs and either how people think we get there, or even what that end state ought to look like, is something that I think we've kind of lost in terms of how to connect those things. And there's a few reasons, I think, for that. Part of that is because of that atomization of culture. Common culture is part of what is necessary for you to have outcome-based decisions. I think there's also, and I know, Joe, I think in your intro you kind of mentioned, you know, the critical thinking as being a piece of this forum. I think we've lost a lot of capacity for critical thinking in a way that makes us sort of rigorous about how we use language and what words mean in certain contexts, and how we take that forward. And then I don't think we really have, you know, a systems level approach still, again, thinking about interoperability, thinking about governance, thinking about decision making for really accommodating the true diversity and richness of kind of how we think about these things. So to close, you know, kind of bring this back to where I think there's opportunity and sort of how we approach this as an organization, looking for these solutions, right? Because it's easy to get sort of mired in some of the, deep philosophical or existential, worries about how we, get things done. And that's part of why we really take this project focus. When I talk about Solutions Lab, it's let's look for real opportunities to do a real thing, and not necessarily worry so much about the big picture. Is this really the shared vision for our whole community? That may not matter. There may be one organization, and Leslie Scott is our digital inclusion program manager. She's on the call, so thanks, Leslie, for joining. She's setting up tables at Full Employment Council, I think at Link, at a couple of the school districts, to go help people get signed up for internet, because we know that there are organizations that have people that can't sign up for their internet bills. We've got some sources where there's money to pay them. We don't need to solve the whole system to go identify a real opportunity and to go do a certain project. And so we really look for action and for actors who are doing things in the community, and try to support people who are doing projects. I mean, this is all of our community building work, is really who are the people that are out there, they're doing things. And we don't worry so much about scale, which in some ways is counterintuitive for an organization that works in technology. A lot of the technology projects that we see, even at a policy level, are, well, how do we scale this? Okay, let's start a little thing, but how do we make it really big? How do we serve the most people? How do we take advantage of the efficiencies of technology to operate at scale? And that's great. It's important to think about scale, and some things can be scaled, but they don't need to be. And you can make an impact at a really human level. So I'd say we've got a few different kind of things that motivate our work. I'd say, or inform, maybe more than motivate. Actions speak louder than words, and they speak louder than committees. So we kind of follow the energy that we see in the community around these topics. We accept people who are maybe a little bit out there, and try to sometimes those are the most active and passionate people, and try to really give them a platform and help move them forward to solve real problems in the community. We assume good intent with our community partners, because in these big systems conversations, you've got a lot of different points of view and a lot of different ways of thinking about how different outcomes ought to be achieved. So we try to assume good intent with the expectation that you'll be disappointed, because inevitably you will. Not always, but you've kind of got to hold both things in mind at once, and then really just focus on controlling the things that we can control, because there is a broad system out there, and there are a lot of different actors, and there are always people that think that what you're doing is wrong, or it's just maybe not the best approach, or that it can be done better. And so really taking sort of an internal and a small focus, but with the big picture in mind. And that's kind of why I wanted to start with us and zoom out really broad, but kind of come back to I think in terms of how we go about our work, it's really important to hold some of those big picture questions in mind, but not fixate on them, and not let them paralyze you from getting out there and actually doing work in the community. And so if you want to get involved in this work, I will leave by highlighting our KC Coalition for Digital Inclusion meetings. We've got a group of stakeholders that are particularly focused on providing digital training, literacy, access, and devices to people in the community in need, to making sure that at a kind of household and individual level, that infrastructure is well distributed. That is a different problem than, for example, making sure that we've got fiber strung throughout the city, or that we've got a utility system in place. But that group meets the first Friday of every month, 10:30 to noon. We used to meet at the downtown Kansas City Public Library. We've been on Zoom for the past couple of years, and are starting to talk through, just like we were at the beginning of this call, how we move back to kind of in-person or hybrid. But that is a tactical way that we certainly welcome people to get involved, either individuals or organizations who are interested to meet other people who are trying to solve those problems.
All right, well, thank you. Yeah, we've been listening to Aaron Deacon, KC Digital Drive, and the Kansas City Coalition for Digital Inclusion. And also, I want to tell you about next week forum. Tune in next Sunday, and Kelsey Ryan from the Kansas City Beacon, the nonprofit journalist organization, will be here talking about nonprofit journalism and how we can survive and thrive. A question here from Alice Kinch. Alice had a question that these things, that equity is actually inequity, I guess, is actually being sped as innovations come along. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. There was a book, actually, I think, called Automating Inequality by a woman named Virginia Eubanks. I think she was in town maybe a year or two ago. I don't remember at what organization, but it is 100% a risk. And I think it's a thing that is, I mean, the technology makes us more efficient at whatever it is that we do. Or at least that's kind of its role. So to the extent we have people that are doing bad things, or that want to do bad things, either on purpose because they're bad, or because they're bad side effects of something else that they want to do that they don't know about, technology makes that easier. It also sort of heightens the risk of some of the mistakes that we might make. We've seen all sorts of things. I mean, you look at highway construction, I think is a example that people like to talk about, mid-century, and kind of what that did to our cities, and some of the byproducts of that we're living with now. And that happened over a very long period of time. I mean, that was a systems level sort of infrastructure kind of project that there were certainly probably some bad motivated actors, but I think a lot of well-meaning actors that think, oh, well, this is going to be, this is going to make things more equitable. It's going to make it easier for people to access things. And, you don't anticipate necessarily the side effects. When in the way that technology advances now, those things happen a lot faster, and at more scale. And so, I'd say that's a good example. And there are a lot of people that are working on this problem at different levels, kind of thinking about what systems do we put in place to make sure that we don't do that. There is I'm part of the Center for Practical Bioethics here has set up an ethical artificial intelligence advisory council that we serve on, that is looking at that in a healthcare context. So it's an example kind of for us in terms of how we engage in that, but also other people out in the community that are trying to put things in place. But I would tell you, it's there aren't easy answers out of that work.
But I would say that you need a checklist, an ethical checklist on every system you're designing, because when I say automated inequality, we're talking about what the Division of Social Services is doing, eliminating people who are eligible for Medicaid expansion, just rolling off thousands of people. In Indiana and other places, child welfare system has, just run things through the system, and what you get is horrific decisions. So somewhere it's either efficient, but it's not human, and it really creates more problems than it helps. And so I think you ought to have a structured, required, any system that's put in place, it must have a structured checklist, and then a welcoming of whistleblowers at the onset of these problems, because they're happening at gross, tragic levels.
Yeah, no, I think I think you're right, and certainly, I mean, that's I know within this committee in healthcare, there are we are going down that checklist road, but I'll tell you that those things are really hard to implement, and they're also one of the sort of underlying philosophical questions that I think we don't do a great job of having is sort of the world as it is versus the world as we'd like it to be. And so you put those checklists together, and yes, you create this scenario. And then at the same time, even in the year that it takes you to do those checklists, there's 10 more projects that people have just launched within an organization, partly because the checklist isn't in place. And even if you had the checklist in place, people are going to implement it to different degrees of fidelity, and some people may not do it at all. And then you've got, it just evolves so quickly, and there's a way that we'd like to think that it should work. And then you get to the point that Ken made in chat, which is, that somebody's got to create those checklists and be the arbiter of what are not always easy or intuitive decisions, and that are based on really different competing value sets. And so you've got somebody who ends up making decisions and, saying, here's the checklist, or you were, faithful to the checklist, or you weren't, that has a real fundamental disagreement at an underlying level with somebody else. And so I don't have great answers, but but I absolutely agree with your casting of the problem.
And Craig's got a question.
Yes, about your analysis of the big picture and utilities. Water and electricity have a known quality within a very narrow band, but data and information, which is the resource you're talking about, has a very wide range of quality from good to false. So how without interfering with free speech, how do you design your projects to avoid this problem of the bad data or bad resource?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that was the point that I was hoping to make, is that I think that is a place where the analogy breaks down. In terms of our own projects, I'd say we try to be fairly limited in scope, right? So we try to really zero in on what is the thing that we're trying to do, and hopefully by being thoughtful and intentional about scope, avoid some of that. But to the broader question, I don't think we've got a great answer to that, and I think part of that is recognizing it. And like the water, the water, I mean, I think sometimes about, what if water pipes could deliver any liquid to home, and people got to choose whatever it was, whether it's soda or tea or coffee or gin. Would we think about the water utility system differently?
Heaven forbid.
Aaron, how big of a revelation was the impact of the pandemic, and how did that change what you're trying to do? What, first of all, were you surprised by the revelations, and then how did you react to it?
I was I'm trying to think if surprised is the right word, or if it's just dismayed. A little bit of both. Just at how sort of disconnected our systems are. I mean, so just surprised, I guess. I mean, I guess surprised is a good word. We've got each county has their own public health department. In Jackson County, KCMO has its own health department. Actually, since the pandemic started, the City of Independence restarted its own health department, separate from Jackson County's health department, because they didn't like what Jackson County was doing. So you see, like, again, at a real practical level, hey, we are a city within a bigger county, and we don't think your health department's doing the right thing, so we're going to start our own health department. So now we have 7 health departments within, the 5-county Kansas City region. We don't have technology infrastructure to share data. We don't have policy infrastructure to, kind of talk about things like mask mandates, or, what community spread looks like. And even now, 2 years later, I saw I think it was in the Star maybe yesterday, that Johnson County is at a medium level of community spread, and so CDC guides suggest one thing, and Jackson County is a high level of community spread, so CDC guidelines suggest another thing. And I'm thinking, what are they talking about? Like, this is all one community. You can't have, I mean, it makes no sense. And almost everyone that's working on it knows that it makes no sense. And yet here we are 2 years later, having to deal with that. So yeah, I'd say, you know, very, very surprised. And again, our work is looking at little projects. I mean, sometimes little, sometimes they're kind of big, but okay, you know, we're not going to necessarily solve all of that. But I'd say, like, one example, you know, Wyandotte County was the first county to put a symptom self-reporting tool online. This was last March, and it was just like, hey, you know, we want to get a sense of how widespread these symptoms are. We're trying to learn about the disease, and none of the other counties have one online. And so we called the other, you know, 5 counties. Oh, well, that's a good idea. I'm glad Wyandotte County's doing that. Yeah, maybe we should do that too. And, you know, there are other people all across the country doing this. So it's not like, you know, that was just one idea that was shared and spread. Ideas like that come into being in several places at once. The reality was there were 5 different software tools that were used to do data collection, 5 different, you know, kind of survey platforms. They were all asking a little bit different questions. And so, like, that's an example where one thing we can do is, okay, well, can we at least ask some of the same questions? What questions are you asking? Why are you asking it this way? Yeah, Johnson County's asking it this way. Would you mind tweaking your language a little bit so at least we can look at it across? And there's willingness to do that. And it's, you know, a really specific kind of narrow project that is an opportunity. But that's not anybody's job. There's nobody who is the, you know, regional health intake form coordinator. And there's an issue of language. You know, what language and what questions are you going to use? Which software are you going to use? Where does the data go? How do we put the data together on the back end? So if we wanted to look at a whole picture across, you know, 4 or 5 different jurisdictions. So that's an example of a kind of thing that I wouldn't have thought we would be doing, that we helped with, but also illustrative of kind of how big the problems are, because that's just, you know, a lot of complexity in that one sort of seemingly little issue. And I'd say the other thing is, and this was, you know, we advocated for a long time, and I don't think very successfully, to really setting some goals in terms of how we manage the pandemic. And I don't know that we ever have after Stop the Spread. I mean, there was a clear sort of period of, okay, we got to lock down. We want to get, you know, community spread, or stop the surge. You know, we want to make sure that our hospitals are not overwhelmed and we don't have people out in the streets like they did in Italy. And I think there was some consistency of message and consistency of policy. But I would have really liked to see a locally driven sort of look at, here's where we hope that it ends, or here's what we're shooting towards, whether it's, you know, I don't know, I could go deeper on that, but it was sort of, you know, in terms of casting a vision and an end state, it's a hard thing to do. I mean, I'm not trying to, you know, be overly critical, because, you know, you do that and there's a good chance that you're going to be wrong. But I feel like at a leadership level, that there's a lot of, well, we just don't know. We're just going to follow the science, and we'll just see where the science leads us. And we're going to kind of take this meandering path, and things are going to change. And, you know, I guess I'd like to see, people be a little bit more sort of goal and vision oriented, use that science then to inform and adapt and change. But I don't know, that's an example where I think there's different functions that we didn't, that this sort of revealed that some of them just didn't get done.
And there's also, I guess, talk about the concerns about balancing privacy, people's fear of information being shared. I know, like contact tracing, there's a digital ways with phones to really do that very well, but it went up against people's fears. I mean, what are some examples where you've run into that, and how do you try to balance that?
Yeah, I mean, another great question where I think we have about zero conversation about what we mean by privacy, what we ought to mean by privacy, and how we navigate between very, very different underlying beliefs, I think, about what is appropriate. Some of that's generational, but I don't think I think we go about a lot of these conversations with an assumption that everyone thinks privacy is something that we value, and everyone kind of means the same thing by that. And I just don't think that's true. And the amount of privacy that people are willing to give up for certain conveniences or efficiencies is widely varying between individuals. And so you've kind of got, you know, an individual conversation, but then there's also the conversation of what is actually best for society. What should we mean by privacy, and what levels of privacy, you know, should be sort of individual discretionary, and which ones, you know, shouldn't, because otherwise you're shooting yourselves in the foot as a community. We don't have a vocabulary or a forum, I don't think, for having those discussions. And so it's a big concern for sure.
And so what would you like to be the biggest takeaway as far as what's possible? What's the best example of, like, hey, I mean, this is why you do this?
Well, I mean, I would say, you know, my hope, kind of going back again, reflecting on 10 years into this, and what seemed like the opportunity at the outset is that by, I think Google Fiber coming here, having sort of a big technology pilot project, and it's funny to think of that as a pilot project when it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But you know, in some ways it was an innovation project, and by doing the work, by doing the project, it inspired a whole bunch of people to start thinking about these things in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. And so you know, I don't know what that ultimately means in terms of our ability to come up with answers, but I do think kind of the takeaway is, by getting out there and doing work, working on projects and creating new things and exploring innovation, you've got a context in which I'm hopeful that people can develop the vocabulary, have the conversations, learn to work together in really concrete and specific ways, and hopefully that leads to the ability to develop kind of the system's capacity to make better collective decisions.
All right, we've been listening to Aaron Deacon, Kansas City Digital Drive, the Kansas City Coalition for Digital Inclusion. Thank you, Aaron, for being our guest today. And we'll remind you that next week we will have Kelsey Ryan from the Beacon here on the All Souls Community Forum, talking about nonprofit journalism and how it can survive and thrive. So thank you again, everybody, and good day.